Okay, so apologies, sorry about that. We have Parshas Beshalach this week, and we're just going to talk for a minute about the idea of the Haftorah. So every week in Shul we read the Torah portion of the week, which is we divide up into 7 portions, and there are 7 people called up to make a bracha on each of those 7 portions. And then at the end we read a Haftorah. The Haftorah is a selection from somewhere among the prophets, the Nevi'im, that is related to the Torah portion of the week. Now the reason we do that, where that originated from, was a time when we weren't allowed to read from the Sifrei Torah. We weren't allowed to read the Torah portion because of the laws of the land wherever we were at the time. And so the custom was adopted that because we couldn't read the Torah portion, which we usually do, instead the rabbis selected for each week a portion from the prophets that we would read instead. Then once we were once again able to read the Torah portion, we weren't going to drop the reading of the prophets, which we had adopted, so now we do both. So that's the Haftorah. The Haftorah is a portion of the prophets that we read that is related to something fundamental in the Parsha. The Haftorah this week, it's Parshas Beshalach. Beshalach is Beshalach Paroi Yisroel, when Paroi sent the people out. So Paroi sent us out of Egypt, and we have the crossing of the Red Sea, etc. So, well, not etc. Let's talk about that very briefly. Paroi sends us out of Egypt. We leave. Then Paroi regrets his decision to send us out. He sends the army after us to come and, capture the Jewish people and bring them back to Egypt. When they catch up, because the Jewish people had a head start, by the time the Egyptian army caught up, the Jewish people were standing right in front of the Red Sea, and we were between a rock and a hard place because we had water in front, Egyptian army behind. So what happened was, Nachshon ben Aminadav, he just starts walking into the water. He says, Hashem told us to go. I'm going to do what Hashem said, and I'm going to go. And he just starts walking, and he's walking and walking into the water, and it's getting deeper, 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 deeper. Eventually, when it got to a point that he wasn't going to be alive anymore if he kept on going. Once he wasn't able to breathe anymore, the water split, and the water split. There was dry. The bottom of the water was accessible and dry, and the Jewish people walked through. And the Egyptian army chased through behind them, and as the Egyptian army entered the water, it crashed down on top of them, not on top of the Jews, and the Egyptian army was wiped out. They all drowned. The Jews came out on the other side, and then they sang. So we say every morning in davening, Oz Yosher Moshe, then Moshe sang, when they came up on the other side. And also, it says, Vatan lahem Miriam, and Miriam also sang with the women. So Moshe and the men sang to rejoice on the salvation. Miriam and the women sang. In the Haftorah of this week, we're going to read about Shiras Devorah, the singing of Devorah, a prophetess. She was a prophetess and a leader, and it makes sense, right? The singing is one of the big things that happens in this week's Parsha, so we're going to read something from the prophets about singing. The question is, why is it that when the rabbis selected this portion of the prophets to read about, this story of Devorah singing, why did they select this specifically? We understand why they wanted it to be something about singing, but there are many options available. We have a very prominent story of David HaMelech singing and rejoicing and celebrating. Why is it that they specifically chose this story of Devorah singing out of all the available options? Yes, we know in the Parsha that Miriam and the women sang, so, maybe we want to match up with that. Moshe and the men also sang. Now, it's not so much, in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, there's the word shaila, which means a question, which means anything that ends with a question mark, basically, is a shaila. And then there's the word kasha. Kasha, the root, the shorish of the root of the word kasha is kosher, difficult, hard. A kasha doesn't just mean a question. What's the weather outside? That ends with a question mark. That's a question, that's a shaila. If you ask someone what's the weather outside, that's a shaila. It's not a kasha. A kasha means a query about something that doesn't seem to make sense. It's kosher, it's difficult to understand. Right? If I say to someone, oh, why are you wearing that coat? That's probably, depending on the context, it's a shaila, it's a question. Because I felt like it, because it matches the boots that I wanted to wear, because I'm in the mood, because it's the first one that came out of the coat closet when I reached in, whatever it is. If someone says, why are you wearing that coat? It's 110 degrees outside. That's a kasha, right? It's difficult to understand. I don't understand how this makes sense. Why would you be wearing a coat today? Right? So both of them are, why are you wearing that coat? One of them's a shaila, one of them's a kasha. So this isn't a kasha per se. There's no reason why it should have chosen, they should have, or we're not presenting an argument as to why they should have specifically chosen David HaMelech singing versus Devorah. It's not a kasha, but it is a shaila, and we could have asked it no matter which one they would have chosen. If they specifically chose a story of Devorah, there's a reason why, whatever their choice was going to be, it was intentional. Why did they choose this one? And to some degree, you can get an answer very simply. If we look in the parsha, there are two instances of singing. There's Moshe and the men celebrating and rejoicing in the salvation. They came out of the Red Sea alive, and the Egyptians were gone. They weren't a threat anymore. Amazing, beautiful. And Miriam and the women sang. There's a difference. It might not be a difference that we notice as being such a big deal necessarily, but it's a difference that's explicitly described in the psukim. It says that Miriam and the women sang betufim uvim choles. They used instruments and they were dancing. They played musical instruments and they danced, as opposed to the men that were just singing. The level of celebration that the women demonstrated was far greater, a much greater level and intensity of celebration. So it makes sense that maybe the Haftarah should honor that by choosing an instance of women singing and celebrating, because the women clearly took the rejoicing and the celebration of our salvation much more seriously than the men did. They took it to a much greater extent than the men did. So that more or less answers that, let's say. But the question becomes, why? Now, obviously, never mind. Not sure we should go there. Yeah. So, if we look at what were they celebrating? The Jewish people, the men and the women, were celebrating the exodus from Egypt. What is it that they were celebrating? They weren't celebrating, oh, we left Egypt. Because whoop-de-doo. Well, it's the miracle, but it's more than the miracle, it's the benefit. What happened? We were in Egypt suffering in slavery, being oppressed, being hurt, being tortured. We left Egypt and now we are free of that pain, suffering, and oppression. That's what the celebration is. Right? If you ask, if someone, let's say someone never heard of the story, the history, nothing, and they're just like, what are you celebrating on Pesach? And you say, we're celebrating that we left Egypt. I might say, well, what's so good about leaving Egypt? Like, I don't know, why is that something to celebrate? Maybe Egypt was an amazing place where you lived in wealth and prosperity, and then you went to travel in the desert for 40 years. It doesn't sound like something to celebrate to me. It's like, well, no, that's not what happened though. Right? So we're not celebrating leaving Egypt. We're celebrating liberation and salvation from that suffering which we experienced in Egypt. That's really what we're celebrating. If we look at the pain and suffering that we experienced in Egypt, and we see that the pain and suffering that was experienced by the women was greater than the pain and suffering that was experienced by the men, that will explain why the women celebrated to a greater degree. Now, there were a lot of things that were uncomfortable and unpleasant and painful, and there was a lot of oppression, but slavery and hard work, it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. But the pain that results from brutal physical labor, brutal physical oppression, doesn't even come close to the pain that's going to be experienced when one sees pain, suffering, or God forbid, the loss of their children. And there was a point when Paro decreed that Kol ha-ben ha-yilod ha-yo'er tashlechu. Any Jewish boy who is born has to be thrown into the Nile River. Why? Because his stargazers, his astrologers saw this prophecy that there was going to be a Jewish boy who's going to be born soon, and it's going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And so he decided he's going to make sure all the Jewish boys get killed to prevent that. Now, apparently Paro didn't read enough sci-fi novels, or he would have known that it doesn't work that way. You can't just override the stars, and Moshe Rabbeinu was saved, and he was that boy who they accurately saw in the stars, and he raised him in his own palace, and Moshe Rabbeinu ended up taking the Jewish people out of Egypt. But that pain, the pain and suffering that was experienced by the Jewish people when Paro decreed that every male child has to be taken and drowned in the Nile River, the pain and suffering of any slavery, no matter how brutal, is not coming close to that. And the fact is, the reality is, and we could come at this from a number of different angles to explain it, but the reality is what it is. At the end of the day, the bond that a mother has with a baby is different to the bond that a father has with a baby. Let's say what it boils down to is, more or less, and this is ultimately speculation and theorizing, but it's reasonable and it makes a lot of sense. And this is what an evolutionary biologist will tell you is the same reasoning. At the end of the day, a newborn baby primarily depends on the mother to survive infanthood, and the likelihood of a child surviving is enhanced when the mother has a greater sense of love and attachment to the baby. The more a mother loves and feels attached to her baby, the better care she's likely to take of that baby, and the better the chance that baby is going to have of surviving. It's not to say that fathers don't love their children, but the depth and intensity of attachment that a mother feels, particularly when it comes to a newborn baby, is going to be greater in a healthy situation than that of the father. Now, if the greatest pain and suffering that the Jewish people were subjected to in Egypt was this degree of Paro taking, the Paro's decree that the boys have to be taken and drowned in the Nile River, at the end of the day, the fact is that the pain that the mothers experienced was greater than the pain that the fathers experienced. It was a greater intensity, a greater depth of grief. So when they came out of Egypt and they were liberated and they were safe, and it was that whole thing was behind them, right? What are we celebrating? If we're celebrating something good, a good change, either something good happened or something bad stopped happening, the greater the shift, the greater the positive change, the more intensely we're going to celebrate. It's very simple. The celebration is an expression of joy, of relief. And so the greater that sense of joy and relief, the greater the celebration is going to be. The women experienced relief from a greater intensity and depth of grief than the men experienced. So naturally, their urge to celebrate and rejoice was deeper and more intense than that of the men. The men had suffered plenty and had a lot to celebrate, and they did sing. But for the women, the depth of grief that they had suffered was greater. And so the depth of and intensity of the joy was greater, and they didn't just sing, they sang, they danced, they played musical instruments, they went all out. Okay, That all makes sense. Well, the math all adds up, let's say. What does that have to do with us? The first thing that we're going to have to clarify is, if the focus of this is that, let's say, let's break it down into a couple of pieces, a couple of steps. We have, is this a dry erase marker? Yes. Boys. I don't know if that's the case here per se. He was just scared of the boys, because there was a prophecy that one of the boys who's going to be born is going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. So he just wanted to kill the boys to protect himself and to protect their slavery. I don't think it was intended as a way to specifically get at the women more than the men per se. I haven't seen anything anywhere that indicates that. Boys. Okay, let me add one more word here. Immersed. And as a result of being immersed, drowned in the Nile River. That's going to lead to the parents' grief. And as far as the parents' grief is concerned, the mother's grief the grief of the mothers is greater than the grief of the fathers. Because mothers bond and attachment is greater, more intense than the father's bond and attachment. And that's because, let's say, the mother's involvement, responsibility, in nurturing and raising is greater than that of the men's. Involvement and responsibility in nurturing and raising. Yeah, makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question now, how does this relate to us? Well, what does this represent? Let's say figuratively or metaphorically. The Nile River was the source of wealth, the source of life, the source of income, and also a deity, a god for Egypt. Paro said that we have to take these baby boys and immerse them in the Nile River. Right? The entire economy of Egypt was built upon the foundation of the Nile River. The entire culture of Egypt was built upon a foundation of the Nile River, both religiously, socially, everything, just about everything in Egypt was built on the Nile River. And Paro said we have to take these baby boys and immerse them in the Nile River, immerse them in the foundation of our culture, in the foundation of our economy, in the foundation of everything that our society is. Now, why is it that taking a person, and God forbid, immersing them in water to an extent that's not good, why is it dangerous? Because a person needs, we are aerobic organisms, which means we need oxygen to live, to survive. Our bodies can only liberate energy from food, from nutrients, in the presence of oxygen. Our bodies need to use oxygen in order to break down nutrients to release energy. If there's no oxygen, our cells cannot release energy from food, and with no energy, there's no anything. So we need oxygen to survive. Oxygen is the most urgent of all needs, right? Food is important. It's not super urgent. A person can easily survive, days, even weeks, not comfortably, but easily survive if they're healthy without food. Water is way more urgent than food. A lack of water becomes a problem far more rapidly than a lack of food becomes a problem. But lack of water doesn't even come close to how quickly, God forbid, a lack of oxygen becomes a problem. Lack of oxygen becomes a problem in seconds, and it's catastrophic within minutes, like single-digit minutes, handful of minutes. So if one is immersed in water, what happens? We don't have gills. We can't extract oxygen from the water. So if a person is immersed in water, they don't have access to oxygen, because the oxygen is that they need to survive, the most fundamental and urgent need that a person has to live. Their access to that is cut off by the fact that they are immersed in water. And because they're immersed in water, they don't have access to the oxygen. What this means, represents figuratively, metaphorically, is that everything we have at the end of the day comes from where? Comes from the Creator. Our income, our health, our well-being, our food, our water, our oxygen, the lungs with which our body extracts oxygen from the air, and the diaphragm we use to bring the oxygen. Everything comes from Hashem. Time and space come from Hashem. Which means that by definition, necessarily, the surest path to have the things we need is connection to Hashem. That's true for anyone and anything, and everyone and everything. Now for us, that goes a step further, because we are here with a specific purpose. We are here for a specific reason. And that reason is to connect to Hashem through Torah and through mitzvahs, to integrate the divinity of Hashem into the world through Torah and through mitzvahs. That's why we're here. The oxygen of our fulfillment is connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs. The same way that a body cannot stay alive for more than, less than a handful, even a handful of minutes without oxygen, because oxygen is the most urgent requirement that is needed in order for life to exist. Something very similar is true for our purpose and for our fulfillment, and that is our fulfillment depends fundamentally on connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs. Without connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs, there can be no fulfillment. That is the purpose for which we exist. The same way that when a person is, God forbid, immersed in water and their body can't access oxygen, it very quickly becomes fatal. If we are immersed in the Nile, in the fundamentals of a culture, of a society, of an economy that is not ours, you take a fish and put it in the Nile River, it's going to be happy until it gets old. It's going to be fine. But it's not going to work for a person. The Nile River was the foundation of the economy and the society and the culture of Egypt, but not for us. So if we become immersed in that culture, in that society, in that economy, what happens? It removes access to that on which we depend most importantly and most urgently for fulfillment and realization. The oxygen of our souls and the oxygen of our fulfillment and our realization, which is connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs. Now, I use the word immersed specifically, not just because that's what drowning literally is. It's a result of being immersed in water, but this is not to say that we can't interact with their economy. If you live somewhere and you want to eat, you're going to have to interact with the economy. If you live somewhere and you're not entirely self-sufficient within the Torah mitzvahs Jewish community is not entirely self-sufficient completely to have all their needs covered to the extent that's necessary, you're going to have to interact with, other people, and to an extent you're going to have to interact with their culture. You're going to have to interact with the society. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a very big difference between interacting with or becoming immersed in. Interacting with, person can go fishing to get fish out of the Nile River. You throw a line into the Nile River, it doesn't affect your ability to breathe. You can dip your hands in, you can go spearfishing, you can walk in the water up to your waist, you'll be fine. It's the immersion in the Nile River that is dangerous, that is fatal. It's immersion in the culture, in the economy, in the society. That's where the danger lies. Now, yes, there's a fine line. Well, I don't know if I would say it's a fine line, but it's not necessarily always so clear exactly where that line is. Where do you draw the line between, okay, this is just interacting with, and now it's starting to get into the gray area that's sliding into immersion. That's something that, can take a lot of consideration and attention and caution that we're not fooling ourselves, because we're very good at fooling ourselves about all kinds of things. But, this is a challenge that is very real today. And we could break it down maybe into a couple of different things. One, that there are two really that are different to each other. And both are so important, so fundamental, and can be so insidious. And I would say one could be a subset of the other. One is, let's say, perspective. I mean perspective specifically in terms of how things work and how we define reality and, the structure of things and cause and effect and all of that. And another one is values. Right? A person can have very clear belief in Hashem and bitachon, and everything I have comes from Hashem, and whatever I have, should I have to focus on my connection to Hashem. And I personally happen to value cruises and ice cream and all the other things that we could add onto that list. So there's values, right? And at the end of the day, it's something that we have to be wary of. If someone has to go fishing to survive, if a person has to get fish from the Nile River if they want to eat, they are going to need to exercise caution that they don't drown when they're interacting with the water. If someone can sit at home in their living room and order food with Uber Eats, they don't have to ever exercise caution not to drown because they're not going anywhere near the water. But if you need a fish in the Nile River and maybe you need to go spearfishing and you need to be waist deep in the water in order to survive, in order to eat, you have to develop the skill of being able to do that safely. If we have to, and most of us do, there is a role, and there are roles in the community for people who don't interact with the culture at all, or almost at all, and they're people whose role is to just study full time and to be the mentor and the leader, etc. But for the vast majority of us, we do need to get, whether it's ankle deep or knee deep or waist deep or maybe chest deep, most of us are going to have to interact with that water. Most of us have to get into the water, whether it's socially, economically, culturally, most of us probably to varying degrees all of the above. We have to remember and remain clear on the fact that there's nothing wrong with interacting with the society in which you live, with the culture, with the economy of the society in which you live, to the extent that you need to the extent that is responsible, to the extent that is necessary. But there is something devastatingly dangerous as far as our fulfillment and realization is concerned, about immersing in it, about starting to adopt the values of the culture, of the society, of the economy, and adopting the perspective of the society, the culture, and the economy. A person can go to work, can have a job, can manage a business, and can work very hard and honestly and diligently and put in a lot of effort and focus and attention. And if you're going to run a business, you might as well do it properly. Otherwise, it's kind of bal tashchis to do it and not do it properly and wasting time. If you're going to do it properly. You're going to have a job and get a salary. You have to be honest and you have to put in the time and the effort that you're getting paid to put in. Exactly. There you go. Now, right, you can have a person who maybe runs a company, runs a business, it's their business, or they're employed to manage the business, and they work hard and maybe they work long hours. But when they wake up in the morning, the first thing they do is they say, Moida ani lefanecha, I acknowledge and thank you, Hashem, for my life, for this opportunity, for all the things I have. And they start the day with morning blessings and with davening, with prayer, with plugging in and connecting to Hashem, with clarifying and focusing their perspective and their view and their values. And then they go to work and they work diligently and with effort and focus and attention and maybe long hours if that's what they have to do. But the whole time they know exactly why they're doing it. They're doing it because, you know why? Because Hashem said so. Hashem said you're not allowed to sit at home with your feet on the couch, eating ice cream and smoking cigars and saying, Hashem will provide. Because you know what? Yes, Hashem will provide. Everything comes from Hashem. But Hashem said you have to be pragmatic, you have to be responsible, you have to be practical. That's the reason you go to work. Not because you need to go to work to have what you need. What you need is going to come from Hashem. Hashem said you have an obligation to be responsible and practical. That's the reason. So this person goes to work and they work hard and focus and attention and long hours, knowing that they're doing it because Hashem said so. At no point during their day or their career, and maybe they have a long and, career that a lot of people aspire to and are jealous of and everything else, but for this person, the whole time, every minute of every day throughout this career, and maybe they accumulated tremendous wealth, but they did it all knowing that I'm doing this because this is the way Hashem said I need to live my life. This person's value is Hashem. Their value is the values of Torah. Their value is mitzvahs. Their value is not money. Their value is not wealth. Their value is not status. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah you're not allowed to have wealth or status or anything else. And if a particular person is gifted and has this mission in their life, they can do that and they should do that. And they can go, fly fishing and they can be waist deep or chest deep in the water as long as they have access to oxygen, as long as they can still breathe, as long as their life is coming from Torah, mitzvahs, connection to Hashem, they're fine. Some people, now some people, there are some people, we could, metaphorically talk about how tall people are. There are some people that can be 5 feet deep in water, and they're not going to be there for very long because that 5 feet is above their nose. And there are some people who could be 6.5 feet deep in water because they're 7 feet tall. Right? How deeply we can be in the water varies from person to person. But the thing that's consistent and exactly the same for everyone is our nose and mouth have to be above the water. What is that? Our nose and mouth represents where we get our oxygen from. The oxygen of our meaning, the oxygen of our realization is connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs, which means every single part of our connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs has to be above the water, has to be above the culture, the society, the economy. And the moment that the values of the culture, the values of the economy, right? What's the difference? Going back to this person who's, running this business very successfully, you'd have two people who look very, very similar at first glance, but as soon as you start to get to know them a little, you see a very, very stark difference. If you're just looking at the behaviors and the hours they work and their bank accounts, looks very similar. But one of these people, their value is money, their value is status, their value is wealth. And you'll see it in the way they walk, you'll certainly hear it in the way they talk, in the way they interact with people, in all the subtleties of how they manage themselves and go around their life. You'll see their values are money, wealth, status. And the second person's value is connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs, integrating divinity into the world. The well-being, the spiritual, obviously physical and spiritual well-being of their family, of their community, of the people they care about. One of these people's, they're both immersed in the water. One of them has had their values co-opted by the economy, by the culture, by the society, and one of them has retained their values. The second one is still breathing oxygen. The oxygen of their purpose, the oxygen of their realization is connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs, and they're still breathing that. They're in the water, but they're not drowning. They're still breathing oxygen. They still have access to that. And having values and perspective co-opted by the values and perspective of a non-Torah culture can be very insidious. It can happen very slowly and gradually and subtly, and we don't realize. But it's catastrophic. Over time, a person can even be living a life technically by the book of Torah and mitzvahs, but their values have been completely distorted. And they value status and wealth, and they can do all the mitzvahs and follow all the halachas and all the customs, but they're not even thinking about Hashem one time while they do it because their values have been completely co-opted by something else. And their perspective and the way they see things, I have to do this in order to have that because, the way that I'm going to have this wealth is by working, and the more work I do, the more wealth I'll accumulate. And it's not an unreasonable, I would say, veering off. It's not an unreasonable error to make. A person who's working hard and looks at the numbers and sees that, at the end of the day, you can see a causal relationship between work and income, work and revenue, work and wealth. It's not unreasonable that a person could make that mistake of starting to prioritize work because they see the work as the means to the wealth. But it is wrong. It's not an unreasonable mistake, but it is a mistake. The wealth comes from Hashem, determined by Hashem. Hashem said, you have to work. That's why we work. And the moment that our perspective gets co-opted by the perspective of society, of the economy, of the culture, the moment that our values get co-opted, the moment one drowns, the moment one's access to oxygen is cut off because their nose and mouth are immersed in the water, is the moment that, God forbid, they're not able to breathe anymore. The moment that our values and our perspective are immersed in, are under the surface of this society, of the culture, of the economy, is the moment that our purpose and our realization stops having access to its oxygen, which is connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs. And that's the moment that our fulfillment and realization stops being able to continue existing. Now, the end doesn't come with the same suddenness as, God forbid, a person drowning. We have, thankfully, a very long runway to sort of correct course and to catch up and straighten things out. But at the end of the day, Paro said, take the boys and immerse them in the Nile River so that they drown because they don't have access to oxygen anymore because they're immersed in the water. Figuratively, take the boys, take the children, immerse them in the culture. Immerse them in the culture and the economics of the society so that they lose their connection to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs, the oxygen of their purpose, of their realization, of their fulfillment, and then those things drown. At the end of the day, I just want to finish this and I'll take questions. The same way that the actual drowning of the babies in Egypt had a deeper and more intense impact on the mothers because the attachment, the depth and intensity of the attachment and connection that the mother has to the baby is greater than that of the father. Why? Because the mother's involvement and responsibility, the role of a mother in raising and nurturing a baby, a newborn baby, is greater than that of the father in ideal circumstances. And a similar thing is true here. You know, it's very, very clear, like black and white, tangibly, biologically, a newborn baby, ideally a newborn baby is best off getting its nourishment, let's say, from nursing. That's the mother's role. But it doesn't just stop there, it continues because, you know, the way that things are set up, the way that Hashem constructed people, is that nurturing role is attached to and associated with the mother to a greater degree than the father. And of course, a father's involved, should be involved in nurturing and raising and all those things, but the intensity of the attachment and the depth of that role is greater for the mother than it is for the father. And that continues beyond just being a newborn and beyond just being an infant and beyond just being a toddler. And so the role and responsibility and honor and privilege and these things always go together. Responsibility and privilege always go together. Of raising the child and making sure that this child is breathing oxygen. Making sure that this child has deeply, fundamentally grounded values and perspective that are accurate and aligned with the values and perspective of Torah. The truest perspective and the truest values, that depends ultimately on both parents, but the role of the mother is greater than the role of the father. And when it comes to that relief, to the benefit, to the joy that results from that, the mothers get to celebrate more than the fathers. Like in this week's Parsha, the women celebrated, the men sang, and the women also danced and played live music. They got to rejoice more because they had invested more, they had a greater sense of joy, they had invested more, worked more, had this greater attachment and greater, let's say, share of the responsibility and the honor and privilege of raising and nurturing these children. And when the immersion of the children in the Nile River stops, right, that's what this role is that we're talking about. They had a greater rejoicing, a greater joy and celebration about the fact that the children were not being drowned in the Nile River. And the same thing when you know, the younger generation is raised up with healthy, proper, accurate Torah values and perspective, i.e. not immersed, not drowned in the Nile River, they have access to the oxygen of their purpose, of their fulfillment and their realization. That's going to be celebrated and it's going to bring a greater degree of joy to the mothers than to the fathers because they have a greater share of that responsibility and of that opportunity and role. Which is why in the Haftarah of this parsha in which we talk about the rejoicing of the Jewish people coming out of slavery and oppression and the immersion of the babies in the Nile River, we read the Haftarah of Devorah and the women celebrating rather than choosing an example of men singing. Okay, we had a couple of questions. Did you still have a question? It's nice to have you back, first of all.
Thank you. It's nice to be back. So, okay. The kalipa is so hard over there, right? Sometimes something that seems to be very cool and something that I can uplift and bring to that new level seems like a very cool thing. But in reality, it turns out to be sometimes that it's a huge kalipa. So how to understand where, like, before, I think like 10 minutes ago, you said that like the world is so beautiful. It's like it's such a nice place to be. But how to understand where there is an opportunity to uplift the thing, where it's a huge kalipa and you just have nothing to do with that right now?
Okay, that's a good question. The first step is, does it say something in halacha? Right? If someone says, you know what, I'm going to uplift these pork ribs. They look so nutritious, and I'm going to go make a beautiful bracha and use all the energy for Torah and mitzvah. It's like, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Torah says you can't eat it, you can't eat it. Right? So anything that Shulchan Aruch says you don't do, that's a given. Within the things that we can do, it can be somewhat challenging. The first thing we have to do is we have to try as best as we can to be honest with ourselves and not to fool ourselves. We have to, sometimes it's a good idea to ask for input from someone else, right? From a friend, a teacher, a mentor, whatever it is. And you know what, sometimes we just have to try our best, and then afterwards sometimes we realize, you know what, yeah, that wasn't the right call. And you know what, that's also part of life. Part of life is doing our best and learning. Like, there's nothing wrong with the fact that we did our best and we made a decision that turned out not to have been ideal, but we didn't do anything wrong. We did exactly what we were supposed to do, because that's how you learn. Right? When you have a kid who wants to do something and they're like, oh, which one should I do? I don't know what to do. Sometimes you're going to help the kid much more by telling them, you know what? Do what you think makes the most sense and see how it goes. They're going to end up much better off than if you tell them what you think is the best idea. And when they're hesitant and they're like, but tell me what to do. And you say, you know what? The only reason I know what to do is because when I was a child, I tried. And I learned, and some things work better than others, and I figured out, and that's how I know. And I want you to have that same knowledge. And that's how you're going to learn. And that's the right thing to do. Doing the best we can is the right thing to do, period. And sometimes it's not the right thing to do because it ended up being the right thing that we chose. It's the right thing to do because that's how it works, and that's what we're supposed to do, and that's how we learn and figure things out.